Hello, this lecture is about feminist jurisprudence and feminist theory. And I'm going to cite from the article on the syllabus that gives an introduction to the history of feminist jurisprudence and feminist theory in the Americas. And the article predominantly looks at feminist jurisprudence in the United States of America. So I'll discuss the US tradition, which is similar to Canada, although in other lectures we'll also discuss the relationship between the rights of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people and the law in Canada. Contemporary feminist legal theory is a body of scholarship produced over the last half of the 20th century and the first quarter of this one that proffers explanations of law's complicity in the ongoing subordination of women and sexual minorities, while also pursuing the possibilities within law for achieving lasting gender and sex equality. Its purpose is both descriptive and critical on the one hand, and normative and aspirational on the other. So this is what the author discusses in going over the history of feminist legal theory, or what is also known as feminist jurisprudence. And it should be noted that there are many traditions of feminist jurisprudence, and this article really discusses American feminism, and there are other traditions. Throughout the class, I'll discuss the first book I wrote, which is about Indian feminism, and I'll also cite the work of Farah Naqvi and Bishaka Dutta, who are Indian feminists. And there's a book called 9 Degrees of Justice, which I will cite. And in this book, Farah Naqvi has written a philosophical essay about grief and grievance. And what Naqvi asks is, what does it mean to turn grief into grievance? So throughout the class, many of the cases that we'll discuss and many of the instances of a violation of transgender queer people's rights, women's rights, involve grief, mental and psychological abuse, sexual violence, murder. And so what Naqvi wants to ask in this essay, which is in 9 Degrees of Justice, New Perspectives on Violence Against Women in India, is what does it mean to turn grief into grievance? Following the ghosts is about making a contact that changes you and refashions the social relations in which you are located. It is about putting life back in, where only a vague memory or a bare trace was visible to those who bothered to look. The names Brandon Tina and Billy Tipton have become synonymous with a cluster of questions and concerns about passing, gender identities, memory, history, space, and transgender biography. Brandon was a young woman who passed successfully as a man in a small town in Nebraska, and who was brutally murdered when some local men decided to take their bloody revenge for what they considered to be a grand deception. Billy Tipton was a jazz musician who was only discovered to have a female body after his death. Since Tipton had married several times, and was survived by a wife and adopted children. The revelation of his biological sex created a minor sensation. In the case of each of these transgender subjects, their lives were dismantled and reassembled through a series of biographical inquiries. This chapter, writes Jack Halberstam in their text In a Queer Time and Place, situates transgender biography as a sometimes violent, often imprecise project that brutally seeks retroactively and with the benefit of hindsight to erase the carefully managed details of the life of a passing person. And that recasts the acting of passing as deception, dishonesty, and fraud. I will be asking here, writes Halberstam, what kind of truths about gender we demand from the lives of people who pass, cross-dress, or simply refuse normative gender categories. None of the transgender subjects who I examine here can be definitely identified as transsexual, and none can be read as lesbian. All must be read and remembered according to the narratives they meticulously circulated about themselves when they were alive. By showing his girlfriends respect, generosity, sweetness, and politeness, Brandon Tina excelled in the performance of masculinity that we most often associate with middle-class values of self-restraint and courtliness. His masculinity destabilizes the essential nature of not only male masculinity, but also middle-class masculinity. One of his lovers, Lana Tisdale, commented she was attracted to him, quote, because he was well-dressed and really polite. The kind of guys I knew weren't like that. New in Falls City, weren't like that. They weren't like that at all. Another called him, quote, the perfect woman's man. And still another called him, quote, a perfect gentleman. Many of the women in their accounts of Brandon described him as a fantasy, an ideal, an improved and even aristocratic version of the usual forms of masculinity that they came across in rural America. Brandon constantly walked a dangerous line between identification, friendship, and rivalry. While many of his male friends knew on some level that he was not a man, for short periods of time they did accept him as such. Since so much of what we recognize as masculinity and masculine relations revolve around intense sites of competition and also aggression, Brandon's performance might be expected to raise the stakes considerably within the everyday contestations of manhood. In one cocky picture of Brandon reproduced in Jones' informative true crime mystery, we see Brandon grabbing his crotch while his friend tries to make a bicep. Halberstam goes on to discuss the murder of Brandon Tina and the ways that it came to be represented in film. What Halberstam is interested in is not just the law and the crimes that took place, but what the author refers to as an economy of representation. The reason I discuss these cases of Brandon Tina and Billy Tipton, and I will continue to discuss violence against transgender people throughout the lecture, is because of the absence within feminist theory of any discussion of transgender rights. So the article discusses the history of feminist theory. However, the history of feminist jurisprudence is largely focused on white, cisgender, heterosexual, middle-class women. What does it mean to turn grief into grievance? Statistically, transgender women, and specifically transgender women of color, are murdered at a very high rate. There are many high-profile cases of transgender men who have also been murdered. So if the grief of gender itself produces violence to the point of death, what does it mean then to turn this into legal grievance when the history of feminist theory throughout the world has largely been formed by cisgender heterosexual women, and feminist jurisprudence still sees woman as a stable sign? This is something that we'll discuss throughout the lecture, drawing intermittently on transgender theorists to supplement what is largely a cisgender, white, middle-class canon of feminist jurisprudence. The same is true in India, where a lot of theories about gender and the law still take the cisgender woman to be the object of potential, or the potential victim, and also a legal claimant. So the point of thinking about the readings alongside this kind of theory, this is Halberstam's book about transgender bodies and subcultural lives, is that the history of jurisprudence and the history of feminist jurisprudence is obviously a history that is rooted in a certain tradition, and it is a tradition of white, global north, or white Western philosophy. And there are a lot of things that people take for granted when they make claims about feminist theory, and the kinds of legal claims that people will make on the grounds of gender. And one of those taken for granted concepts or taken for granted ideas is that every person who experiences gender-based violence is a cisgender woman, and this is obviously not true. There's also the kind of unspoken reality of whiteness and Christianity, heteronormativity. So over the years, a lot of what the author discusses as being foundational in feminist jurisprudence has been challenged by different waves of the feminist movement, and also, of course, the transgender movement and the queer movement. I still think, however, and the reason that I've chosen this article is that this history is still important to ground your understanding of jurisprudence from a feminist and queer and transgender perspective, and from a perspective that sees the ways that understandings of law change as understandings of identity claims change. So, who is seen to be a person who has legal rights changes as there are more and more legal precedents that are set by different groups of people. We'll discuss C16 as well and transgender rights as the class goes on. And I'll specifically discuss transgender rights and the passage of Bill C16. And I'll also discuss my own research in India about the rights of hijras and transgender people. So the lecture is then called Above the Law, Feminist Jurisprudence. And I'll give you copies of the PowerPoint slides. What is important about the history of these debates in feminist jurisprudence is that it doesn't really involve censorship. Internet call out culture has created this culture where someone, I guess, calls someone out or even flags them on the internet and does not allow them to have an opinion. And these debates that are had on the part of legal theorists and lawyers don't involve trying to censor people. They involve different philosophical approaches to life and to the law. And these philosophical approaches are grounded in many different people's lived experience. So, Black feminist theory has often, although of course not always, been rooted in standpoint epistemology. This means, from my perspective, a certain set of legal claims might be very important, like the right to secular freedoms and freedom from religious law. This might not be central to someone else's life. This might not be important. The rights to own property and work might be seen to be more central to someone's life than the right to sexual freedom. And so these traditions of liberal feminism and radical feminism that have defined feminist legal theory are obviously not right or wrong. There is not one perfect position that we all share. There is not one interpretation of the law that we all share. There have been many people who are part of the feminist and queer and anti-racist movement who do not believe in the law because from a Marxist perspective and from many people's perspectives, the law is something that often works for you if you have a certain amount of money. So the point with academic debate is to actually have a debate, not to try to prevent people from thinking or speaking or having an opinion. So as your authors discuss, feminist legal theorists, both directly and indirectly, contribute to the construction of various fields of law: civil rights law, constitutional law, criminal law, tort law, contract law, family law, international law, and private law. And those contributions are to varying degrees aimed at ending just that subordination. So, what feminist legal theory has done, much like critical race legal theory, which we'll also discuss in the class when we specifically talk about Black Lives Matter um, and Indigenous rights, is to challenge the law's complicity in injustice and its potential contribution to justice. So, feminist legal theory is not simply about applying the law to non-cisgender male lives and non-cisgender male bodies and non-cisgender male rights or claims. It is about challenging the law from the perspective of those who experience gender-based violence. In December of 2012, I lived in New Delhi, India. I arrived on December 13th, 3 days before a woman named Jyoti Singh caught an off duty bus that had been hijacked by a group of men who proceeded to gang rape and murder Jyoti uh, using a metal rod from a car park. The things that they did to her would perhaps be referred to as triggering within Western media and within popular culture. Jyoti Singh did die, and this is actually quite common. And it leads us back to this question: what does it mean to turn grief into grievance? Jyoti Singh is dead, and her parents were left, I suppose, to file a whole set of legal claims, as was her friend slash boyfriend slash husband, who is referred to as all of these things in the Indian media, had a whole set of legal claims to make. My daughter didn't do anything wrong. She died while protecting herself. Badri Singh Pandey became quite vocal in the Indian media after his daughter was murdered. I am proud of her. Revealing her name will give courage to other women who have survived these attacks. They will find strength from my daughter. Badri said, "At first, I wanted to see the men responsible face to face, but I don't want to anymore. I just want to hear that the courts have punished them and they will be hanged. Death for all 6 of them. These men are beasts. They should be made an example of, and society will not allow such things to happen." We will again continue to visit this question, which is a philosophical question from the essay by Naqvi. What does it mean to turn grief into grievance? There are many legal cases and many cases that make the media only when women have been murdered. And in the case of the Delhi gang rape case, they did use the death penalty in the end. The use of the death penalty and its effectiveness has been debated by many feminist legal theorists and scholars. And one of the problems with the death penalty from a feminist perspective is that after this decision was made in Delhi, what feminist commentators said was that if the death penalty is used in cases of rape, then people who rape women or people who rape people are more likely to kill their victims, so as not to leave a person who is a witness who could testify, because they could die if they're found guilty. So in crimes of gender-based violence, then, if the penalty is very severe, then the person who is being victimized might be more likely to die, because they could live and be a witness, and then the person who is a rapist could die. So this kind of media event, which involves public killing of men who rape women, could actually have this inadvertent effect of making women more unsafe and making people who experience rape, including children and transgender people, more unsafe. However, there are also a lot of questions that activists ask about what these legal precedents and what these huge public cases can offer to the feminist movement. So Catherine McKinnon is a legal scholar who discusses feminist jurisprudence and the effect that simple actions can produce. And Catherine McKinnon's work has been very useful for the feminist movement. And in this clip, they discuss the importance of these laws.
This idea of butterfly politics is an activist concept. What it means is that the right, small, simple intervention into an unstable political system can ultimately produce large, complex, system-wide changes. It's really a strategic idea about law, about how to go in, where to go in, when to go in. It's how sometimes one case or one word in legislation can produce a major social transformation. The concept came out of my 40 years of law practice challenging sex inequality. And sex inequality is, as I see it, an unstable system because it is based on the lie that women are inferior to men. And what I've done is gone specifically after what I see to be the crucial juncture in sex inequality, and that is sexual abuse. So in 1972, the scientist Conrad Lorenz asked the question, does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? When he answered yes, he conceived of what has come to be called the butterfly effect. Some properly targeted, extremely small actions like the butterfly wing can eventually have very large effects that can be difficult to foresee or predict. The idea then became central to a much larger theory called chaos theory, which is not about things being chaotic. It's about things being either irregular or extremely complex, or the causality turning back in on itself in ways that is hard to predict or foresee. And it's used these days, for example, to predict the weather. So it produces a series of the following alternative models could play out. And that's partly why sometimes you see weather predicted as, it could be like this, but the range of possibilities are as follows. So chaos, as I say, doesn't mean lack of pattern. It doesn't mean disorder, only that the patterns are not immediately clear, that they aren't linear. The causality is complex, it's interactive, and it's repetitive, which to me sounds a lot like law and society. So among the things that I've learned in this practice, and in thinking about it in retrospect in terms of butterfly politics, is that changing the power structure involved, and in my work, it's male dominance. And I've focused specifically on sexual harassment, on rape in and out of genocide, on pornography, and on prostitution. And an emerging theory from all of that of what is now being called, and I've called, substantive equality, which is a different approach to equality than the standard legal approach. The things I've learned is that this project is a collective one. It is not in any way an individual one. It takes a movement. Also, it is deeply contextual and grounded, meaning it's not isolated in its setting, and it springs from the realities of social life and relationships within social life. Now, sexual harassment as a practice, according to me, happens because of the sex of the victim and the perpetrator in a culture that encourages and permits sexual predation by dominant groups on subordinate ones. In substance, that is, in content, it is a form of gender-based discrimination. Whoever it is doing what to whoever they are doing it to. So before this, sexual abuse had never been conceived as part of sex inequality. But doing so in law, because it actually is a practice of sex inequality in life, has had a massive systemic effect, politically and legally, all around the world. Law's power to change lies in its capacity, which we give it, to restore a piece of the humanity that the victimization took away. It is this chunk of wholeness, this possibility, this hope for it, that lawyers for violated people, whether rightfully vindicated or wrongfully convicted, hold in their hands. Butterfly politics can animate political activism and support equality advocacy toward this kind of legal change. These small actions in a collective context can change systems, both internationally and domestically. It encourages multidimensional political thinking, precise engagement, principled creativity, imagination, instinct, and adaptability. It inspires interventions, even tiny ones. It opens discussion and debate on strategy and substance as part of a disciplined process of transformation toward equality, including equality of the sexes. It envisions and joins hands with old and new forms of organizing. Because in isolation and in image, butterflies are delicate, even fragile. They can be overlooked or reduced to decoration. But in life, their endurance lies in their collectivity. Their power lies in their collective effect. On its life journey, a butterfly can be collected and categorized. It can die for lack of nutrition, or it can be smashed against a windshield. Yet still, we rise everywhere. So I say, equality seekers, spread your wings. You're stronger than you know. And what butterflies can set in motion, sometimes even one, cannot be stopped.
Catherine McKinnon is a very, very prominent feminist philosopher and scholar, and a lawyer, an activist, and you can look up their name. There is work that is written by them on the syllabus as well. And what I think is interesting about feminist legal theory and philosophy is that, and jurisprudence, is that there is this activist impetus behind this kind of scholarship. So rather than a perfection of grammar or a perfection of citation, which you might find in English or in other disciplines, feminist jurisprudence is quite action oriented. So I'll start by discussing feminist jurisprudence, um, and then I'll discuss liberal feminism, radical feminism, and then I'll discuss critiques of liberal feminism, and finally I'll discuss and radical feminism. So I'll discuss the critiques of these two major positions that define the history of American feminist jurisprudence. And then finally, I'll finish by discussing legal theories. And I'll talk about a few of the legal theories that the author mentions, which challenge these two main schools of thought, liberalism and radicalism. There are obviously other schools of thought as well, but these are foundational within the American tradition. So, legal theory is a body of scholarship that was produced over the last half of the 20th century and the first quarter of this one that proffers explanations of law's complicity in the ongoing subordination of women and sexual minorities. So, the point of legal theory, and this is true of critical race theory as well, is to think about the way that law is complicit in the suffering of queer people, trans people, and women, and also to think about how the law can be a useful tool in supporting legal rights. So, legal theory then attempts descriptively to map the contours of the ongoing legal supports for gender and sex-based subordination in existing law and to explain the persistence of those supports in an era characterized by liberal consensus on the very basis on very basic norms of non-discrimination and formal equality. It is thus a critical theory of law. At the same time, however, feminist legal theory is also embedded in and very actively participates in the ideals, aspirations, and commitments of contemporary legalism, and feminist legal theory's goals are accordingly normative as well as critical. So, the feminist movement then has always been actively involved in changing laws, and this has been true of changes to laws regarding rape, sexual harassment, transgender rights, and queer rights. Also, laws regarding labor and harassment. Um, at the same time that the feminist movement has also been critical of the ways that law uh, is highly discriminatory and even the way that the gendered and racialized and classed body looks can obviously determine how one is received and treated in a court of law and by police. Also, the sound of a voice, accent, class position can already predetermine who has rights that exist in real life. Feminist legal theorists then have contributed to various fields of law. One of these various fields of law is labor law. So when women enter the public sphere, as we'll discuss when we talk about the Me Too movement and cases of sexual harassment and racism in many institutions, including the university system, people often think that women in the public sphere are not working and do not have labor rights. So feminist legal theorists have contributed to labor law and labor unions. Feminist legal theorists both directly and indirectly contribute to the construction of various fields of laws: civil rights law, constitutional law, criminal law, tort law, contract law, family law, international law, and private law. And those contributions are to varying degrees aimed at ending just that subordination. That degree of engagement itself rests on the bedrock assumption that those efforts can at least sometimes bear fruit. So one area in which feminist legal theorists have contributed is labor law. And the idea that gender identity means that you are not working or you do not have the same rights as anyone working is obviously one that contradicts the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and also contemporary labor laws. Feminist legal theory taken in its entirety has shown, if not consistently expressed, a view of law as not only a mechanism for the subordination of over half the human community, but also a potential vehicle for equalizing and improving the quality of life for women and all gender and sexual minorities. The working assumption is that law is both complicit in gender and sexual subordination, and that legal reform is both possible and essential to gender and sexuality justice. As a consequence, broadly construed, feminist legal theory of the last half century has contributed to our understanding of law's complicity in injustice and its realized and potential contribution to justice, and has laid the foundation for continued study of both. So there are many examples that I can think of from labor law that are quite interesting. It is really interesting to think of whose name is Googled in the professional work world. So many times when I teach at the university level, what I find is that no one will Google my name. And I find it interesting to think about who will and who will not Google women's names and women of color's names, and who will make comments about my appearance. I've had students tell me that I am beautiful, particularly if I wear certain jewelry from India, but these people seem to not want to Google certain people's names. And this is clearly about the rights of workers to be seen as workers, and also about time, that when I begin teaching as a university professor, I am not entering into a space as a student to have to be taught anything or told what to do. I am not also a child who is beginning my life again with new parents. I am someone who has earned a series of qualifications that anyone could read about if they Googled somebody's name. So this is where feminist legal theorists contribute to the field of labor law. Liberal feminism. I have the right to wear hats and to spend money on hats. You might not be a hat person, but that is not my problem. Liberal feminism. Liberal feminism is really about individualism and individual expression. It is also about the right to make choices and to change one's mind. So, respecting individual choices made by individuals in open markets is deemed to be the best way to create value, whether value is in turn defined by subjective utility, objective well being, or personal autonomy. So liberalism is really bound to ideas of market rationality, individual choice, and agency. And liberal feminism has been central to feminist jurisprudence throughout the world because the majority of people participate in modern secular capitalist culture. And the idea of choice and individual agency is important when selling one's labor and also important when protecting one's individual rights to do what they want with their money and their body and their time. Second, liberalism eventually came to embrace and indeed be identified with a commitment to the formal equality of persons under the purview of a liberal state, what some call liberalism's anti caste principle. This value as well, the value of formal equality, rests on a set of descriptive and aspirational claims, the most central of which is that every individual should be regarded as similarly situated. That is, as basically the same, with respect to those attributes that matter for legitimate state purposes. Thus, every person is naturally bestowed with a capacity for reason, an autonomous will, and an entitlement to be treated with dignity and respect. What this means is that we are essentially treated in the same way, and what liberal feminists have often argued is for equality. So that liberal feminists would often say that uh, I have legal rights and so do you. Um, and I'll discuss radical feminism after this section of the lecture, as the reading also compares these two perspectives. And these perspectives have been popular in the American tradition, and they largely define Western secular capitalist approaches to the feminist movements. And the reason that these approaches are important is because this push and pull between individual rights that women and queer people have and sexual autonomy and freedom and uh, the body itself really define the contestations and the debates that feminist theorists have had in the Western secular world. So, the constant tension that the authors discuss is between liberal individual rights and the understanding that no matter how many choices I make, no matter how many hats I wear, I can always be stopped in the street and reduced to my body through crimes of rape and sexual harassment. So, the problem for liberal feminists versus radical feminists is that a liberal feminist would say, I have all the same rights as men, but a radical feminist would say that these rights and choices don't matter because of my body and how my body is read on the street. So Jyoti Singh was a student and had all the rights of male students to uh, to be educated. Jyoti Singh was also going to the movies with Awindra Pandey. Awindra Pandey is alive. He was not gang raped and murdered. They both had the right to purchase a ticket to see a movie. Jyoti Singh is dead. So the problem with presuming equality is that liberalism presumes equality. It doesn't create equality on the street. This is also the critique that critical race theorists have of liberalism. I have all the same rights as someone whose skin is white. There's a person named George Floyd who is dead, and George Floyd's death caused or led to one of the largest mass mobilizations of people in the United States of America and throughout the world as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. If someone who is not Black tries to walk in the street as George Floyd did, they would perhaps not experience extreme anti Black racist policing to the point of death. So, The value of formal equality rests on a set of descriptive and aspirational claims, the most central of which is that every individual should be regarded as similarly situated, that is, the same. So these kind of descriptives, we are all the same, every person has the same legal rights, are descriptive and aspirational. However, what critics of liberalism would say is that we don't all have the same legal rights in reality. On paper, this might be true. I might have the exact same legal rights as every white man with a PhD. However, in the end, statistically, as a sociologist, I know that the majority of people of color, the majority of women of color with PhDs do not make as much money. There is also this aspirational claim of liberal feminism that in the future, one day, we will all be equal and our legal rights will matter. So, another claim made by liberal feminists is that we all have the capacity for reason, an autonomous will, and an entitlement to be treated with dignity and respect. That universalism, however, is thin. Beyond those universals, we are all individuals, and our nature is radically individualistic with no shared group characteristics. Our identity is determined by our own choices and individualized attributes, not by any group identity, group defined status, set of characteristics, or roles. So, these ideas then of individualism could be said to be true that I am not the same as every other person. I have my own individual choices to make, my own rational set of claims, and there is no individual person that has my mind or my life or can make my choices. However, what radical feminists say who critique liberal feminists and what other scholars would suggest is that similar experiences of discrimination mean that there are a set of claims that would be referred to as what Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak calls strategic essentialist claims. So, what Spivak argues is that strategic essentialism means that while there's no essential thinking or shared thought or shared universal experience that comes from having a certain body. I don't share the same mind with every person who was born as a cisgender woman. There are these moments of strategic essentialism where what this means is that if women are more likely to experience rape, we might all make similar choices as to walk alone at night or not, or to go into certain neighborhoods or not. However, again, I'll discuss intersectional feminism at the end of the lecture. And we don't all necessarily then have those choices to make because women who do not have middle class privilege cannot make the choice to not walk alone at night or in certain neighborhoods. A lot of people have critiqued liberalism. Marxist perspectives and radical feminist perspectives obviously critique this idea of choice. I cannot make all the same choices as somebody else because I have to work for a living. And I don't make all these autonomous, rational choices because sometimes I am extremely afraid of violence. And so this idea of autonomous will, rationality, respect and dignity is always marred by the possibility of violence and past trauma, which creates fear. So the third point of modern liberalism is that modern liberalism has adhered to the conviction that the private sphere largely construed, including our intimate lives, our family lives, and our commercial lives, is a realm of interaction between free and autonomously self-determined individuals, while the public sphere, the sphere of regulation, politics, and government, albeit necessarily poses a potential danger to the freedom of the individual and to the private sphere. The public arm of the state, therefore, is a potential source of oppression, while the private realms of intimacy, family, and commerce are places of freedom and nurturance. The private sphere must be protected against possible encroachments from the public sphere. So this is another point that has been hugely critiqued by every critic of liberalism, in the sense that the private sphere for radical feminists is often a site of domestic violence, rape, forced gendered socialization, forced heteronormativity, forced cisnormativity. For Marxists, this distinction between the private and the public realm does not necessarily exist. I am working privately, and so the private realm cannot be separated from the public realm in all their spheres of work for the worker. Queer theorists have also critiqued this idea of the sanctity of the private home. And in an essay called Sex in Public, Lauren Berlant and Michael Warner discuss the idea of heterosexual intimacy. And they argue that heterosexual intimacy defines heteronormative culture, which becomes public and national culture. And what Berlant and Warner argue is that there is nothing more public than privacy. They also argue that heterosexual culture constructs this idea of the family as a zone of pre-political humanity. And what the authors suggest is that this idea of privacy and the concomitant idea of heteronormativity create this zone of pre-political intimacy, which is the family. So what heterosexual culture and heteronormativity envisions to do as an ideology that masks itself as an ideology and constructs itself to be normal is to argue that the family has no politics. So we have a family, we all love each other, there's no ideology. And what Berlant and Warner have argued, what Marx and Engels have argued, what feminist theorists have argued, is that there's no greater political unit or no greater politically constituted institution than the family. And normalizing the family as just this place of pre-political humanity and love, obviously does not politicize caste or class or domestic violence or forced heteronormativity, the forced gendering of children, also labor relations and unpaid labor that people do in the family. So this is a clip about feminism and the law. The point is that liberalism has many critics. While
If you want
liberalism and the law have many critics, much like the feminist movement, the law, this kind of critique and this kind of debate does not mean that people, I don't know, try to censor each other or stop each other from participating in activism. Feminist lawyering has been foundational to setting a whole series of legal precedents that queer people, transgender people, and women can use. And so feminist law, legal precedents, the Justice Verma committee that was set up after the gang rape and murder of Jyoti Singh, which changed rape law and sexual harassment law, are all obviously useful tools. Despite the fact that I may experience a great deal of fear when calling police, despite the fact that I might feel as though I will not be treated fairly by lawyers or by the criminal justice system, I still have a whole set of legal rights, and I can still make a whole set of legal claims.